Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because today we will travel together into the murky depths of the Missouri Ozarks in the year 1881, when the frontier was still a place where the law arrived slowly and secrets were buried deep in the red earth. Imagine for a moment what it meant to travel in the United States at that time. There were no paved roads cutting through the barren Ozark Mountains. There were no telephones to call for help. A traveler's only companions were the sound of his horse's hooves echoing off the limestone and the wind rustling through the centuries-old oak trees that dominated this rugged region of Missouri. It was in this isolated and wild setting that two brothers decided to build what they called a traveler's inn. John and William Bender came to Leet County in the early 18th century from somewhere undefined in the east. No one knew exactly where, and they never spoke about the past. What mattered to the few local residents was that finally, someone offered decent shelter to those who needed to spend the night before continuing their journey along the treacherous trails winding through the mountains. The Bender Brothers Inn was strategically positioned at a crossroads known as Devil's Prong, a name that should have served as a warning to the most superstitious travelers. There, where two ancient Indian trails met, they built a two-story wooden house with a large balcony and windows that seemed to overlook all directions. Outside, hanging from a rusty chain, swung a hand-painted sign promising safe shelter, hot meals, and honest prices. The brothers were robust men, typical of the frontier. John, the eldest, was about 40, with a well-trimmed dark beard and eyes that some neighbors described as too deep. William was younger, perhaps 35, taller and thinner, with large hands that seemed capable of breaking thick branches effortlessly. Both spoke little, worked hard, and always greeted guests with smiles that did not reach their eyes. The inn quickly gained a reputation in the region. Merchants traveling between Springfield and Joplin began to include Devil's Prong as a mandatory stop on their routes. Families moving west stopped there to rest before braving the most difficult mountain passes. Even some government officials inspecting federal lands stayed at the Bender brothers' home when they needed to pass through the area. What everyone praised was the seemingly warm hospitality of the owners. The meals were hearty, with smoked pork, slow-cooked beans, and fresh bread baked each morning. The rooms were clean, the beds comfortable, and the price charged was within what any traveler expected to pay for a safe night away from the dangers of the road. But there was something strange about all that hospitality. The nearest neighbors, who lived a few miles away, began to notice certain peculiarities in the brothers' behavior. They never attended Sunday meetings at the small Methodist church in the area. They never appeared at the social events that brought together the families scattered throughout the valleys, and they always seemed to have cash, even during the winter months, when few travelers ventured onto the icy trails of the Ozarks. Even more intriguing was the fact that the Bender brothers never seemed to have problems with thieves or bandits, a constant concern for any isolated establishment at that time. While other properties in the area suffered from cattle theft and invasions, the inn at Devil's Prong remained untouched, as if there was some kind of invisible protection around that wooden house, swaying gently in the mountain wind. It was the late autumn of 1881 when the first suspicions began to arise. A tool dealer from Springfield named Thomas Mackenzie had set out for Joplin on a Tuesday in October, carrying a wagon loaded with axes, saws, and other agricultural implements. His usual route included a stop at the Bender Brothers Inn. By his own calculations, he should have arrived in Joplin the following Thursday. Thomas Mackenzie never reached his destination. His wife, Martha, waited a full week before seeking help. The Jasper County Sheriff organized a search that covered the entire route between Springfield and Joplin, but found no trace of the merchant, his wagon, or his valuable cargo of tools. It was as if Thomas Mackenzie had simply vanished from the dusty trails of the Ozarks, leaving behind only the echo of his passing and a desperate wife who would never hear from her husband again. This was just the first in a series of disappearances that would begin to haunt the Missouri mountains, casting an ominous shadow over the seemingly impeccable reputation of the Bender brothers and their inn at Devil's Prong. The disappearance of Thomas Mackenzie should have been a wake-up call, but in the Ozarks of 1881, people disappeared from the roads with disturbing frequency. Bandits, wild animals, canyon accidents, sudden storms. There were dozens of plausible explanations for the disappearance of a lone merchant on the treacherous trails of Missouri. So when life returned to normal after the fruitless searches, no one imagined that this would be just the first name on a macabre list that would grow silently over the next few months. It was in November of the same year that the second case caught the attention of the authorities. An entire family, the Morrisons, had left Kansas City for Arkansas, where they intended to purchase land to establish a cotton farm. Robert Morrison, his wife Helena, and their 2 young children, 8-year-old Samuel and 6-year-old Mary, traveled in a covered wagon pulled by 2 mules, carrying all the family savings stored in an iron box that Robert kept close at hand. The Morrisons had planned to make the trip in stages, stopping at well-known inns along the way. According to letters Helena sent to her sister in Kansas City, they intended to spend a night at the famous Bender Brothers Inn, which had been recommended by other travelers as a safe and welcoming place for families with young children. Helena Morrison's last letter was posted from the post office in Carthage, a town about 40 miles north of Devil's Prong. In it, Helena wrote enthusiastically about the beauty of the autumn mountains and mentioned that they were looking forward to reaching the Bender Inn, where they could finally take a hot bath and sleep in real beds after so many nights camping outdoors. The Morrisons never made it to Arkansas. They were never seen alive again. This time, the authorities could not ignore the pattern that was beginning to form. 2 different families, 2 routes passing through the same isolated region of the Ozarks. 2 complete disappearances without a trace. The sheriff of Leete County, an experienced man named Benjamin Hayes, decided to personally investigate the area around Devil's Prong. Hayes was a Civil War veteran who had returned to Missouri with scars on his body and soul, but also with a keen instinct for detecting when something wasn't right. During his initial investigation, he spent 3 days riding along the trails that converged on the crossroads where the Bender Brothers Inn stood. He examined every ravine, every dense wood, every rock formation where bodies or wagon wreckage might be hidden. He found absolutely nothing. It was during this search that Hayes had his first formal conversation with John and William Bender. The brothers received him with their usual cordiality, offered hot coffee, and answered all questions with apparent sincerity. Yes, they remembered Thomas Mackenzie, a polite man who had dined with them on a Tuesday in October and left the next morning for Joplin. No, they had never seen the Morrison family, although they admitted that many families passed through the area during the autumn months. What impressed Hayes most was the naturalness with which the brothers talked about the disappearances. They didn't seem nervous or evasive. In fact, they showed genuine concern for the fate of the lost travelers and offered to help with future searches in any way possible. John Bender even suggested that the sheriff should look in the southernmost territories, where known outlaws used to ambush wealthy merchants. But there was something in William Bender's eyes that bothered Hayes, a coldness that contrasted with the warm tone of his voice, a way of looking that seemed to calculate each word before it was spoken. The sheriff left the inn with more questions than answers, but without any concrete evidence to justify formal suspicions. During the harsh winter of 1881-82, the trails of the Ozarks became virtually impassable. Heavy snow covered the mountain passes, and few travelers ventured onto the icy roads. The Bender Brothers Inn was virtually empty during these months, receiving only occasional hunters and local lumberjacks who knew the region well. It was during this period of forced isolation that the brothers made some changes to their property. They built a new barn, larger than the previous one, with thick wooden walls and no windows. They dug a deeper well behind the main house, claiming that the previous one had dried up during the summer, and they began raising pigs, a decision that surprised the neighbors, since the brothers had never shown interest in farming or ranching. When spring arrived and the trails became passable again, the disappearances resumed with alarming frequency. In March, an itinerant preacher named Reverend Marcus Coleman disappeared on his way to a religious gathering in Branson. In April, it was the turn of two cattle-trading brothers, the Taylors, who traveled with a small fortune in cash to buy horses in Texas. Each disappearance followed the same disturbing pattern. Trustworthy people with known roots who simply faded into the hazy Ozark mountains as if they had never existed. And always, invariably, their last known stops were in an area of 20 miles around Devil's Prong. Sheriff Hayes began to keep a detailed record of each case. Names, dates, physical descriptions, intended destinations, approximate values that the victims carried. Slowly, a macabre profile began to emerge from the papers scattered on his desk. All the missing were people traveling alone or in small groups. All carried money or valuable goods, and they had all been seen for the last time heading towards the gloomy crossroads where the Bender brothers offered their seemingly safe shelter. But suspicions were not evidence, and evidence was just what Hayes needed to confront two men who had become respectable pillars of the Ozarks' sparse local community. The breaking of the silence came from where no one expected it. In May of 1882, a 17-year-old named Timothy Walsh showed up at Sheriff Hayes's office on a rainy morning, his face pale and his hands shaking like autumn leaves. Timothy worked occasionally for the Bender brothers, helping with heavy chores and caring for the animals in exchange for a few coins and hot meals. What Timothy Walsh had to tell would make anyone's blood run cold. One April night, while sleeping in the Benders' barn, something the brothers allowed when there was too much work, Timothy was awakened by strange sounds coming from the main house. They were muffled voices, as if people were urgently whispering about something important. Curious and half asleep, the young man silently approached one of the ground floor windows. What he saw through a crack in the curtains would haunt him for the rest of his life. John and William Bender were in the kitchen working by lamplight, but they weren't preparing food. On the large wooden table that normally served meals to guests, there were objects that Timothy initially couldn't identify. Stained clothes, a leather wallet, some crumpled papers, and what appeared to be a small iron box, just like the one Helena Morrison had described in her letters to her sister. But what was most disturbing was not the objects themselves, but the meticulous way in which the brothers examined them. John carefully sorted each piece of clothing, checking pockets and seams as if looking for something specific. William counted coins in a small pile, jotting down numbers on a piece of paper with the concentration of an experienced accountant. Timothy remained paralyzed behind the window for several minutes, unable to fully process what he was witnessing. It was only when William lifted something from the table that glinted in the lantern light, a golden pocket watch, that Timothy recognized immediately that the terrible reality imposed itself on his young mind. That watch belonged to Reverend Marcus Coleman. Timothy had seen the preacher refer to that same watch several times during an impromptu sermon Coleman had given in a nearby clearing a few days before he disappeared. It was a one-of-a-kind piece with intricate engravings on the case and a gold chain that the Reverend always kept attached to his waistcoat. Terrified, Timothy recoiled from the window and returned to the barn, where he spent the rest of the night awake, watching the shadows dance on the wooden walls and trying to find an innocent explanation for what he had witnessed. Perhaps the brothers had found those items abandoned on some trail, Maybe they were saving everything to return to the owners when they showed up. But deep in his heart, Timothy knew he was trying to convince himself of something impossible. The next morning, the Bender brothers acted normally. They served breakfast, talked about the weather, and paid Timothy for the previous week's chores. There was no sign that they knew they had been observed during their nocturnal activities, but Timothy noticed that William was watching him more closely than usual, and that John was asking casual questions about his plans for the next few days. For the next few weeks, Timothy avoided the Bender Inn. He made excuses for not taking extra work, claimed he needed to help his family at home, and gradually cut all ties with the two brothers. But the images of that night continued to torment him. The Reverend's golden watch, the stained clothes on the table, the cold and calculating way in which the brothers catalogued those personal effects of people who had disappeared without a trace. It was the arrival of a new guest at the inn that finally pushed Timothy beyond the limit of his ability to remain silent. In mid-May, a prosperous St. Louis merchant named Edward Hartwell stopped at Devil's Prong during a business trip to Texas. Hartwell was a man known in the region for his generosity and good humor, always willing to share stories of his business adventures with anyone who would listen. Most importantly, he carried a considerable amount of money, something he was keen to hide, as he believed that demonstrating prosperity helped in his negotiations. Timothy saw Edward Hartwell arrive at the inn on a sunny Thursday afternoon. The merchant greeted the Bender brothers enthusiastically, praised the establishment's strategic location, and announced that he intended to spend 2 nights there before continuing his journey. Over dinner, which Timothy watched from a distance, hidden among the trees, Hartwell talked excitedly about his plans to expand his business and showed the brothers some samples of fine fabrics he intended to sell in the South. On Friday morning, Edward Hartwell was supposed to leave for Texas. He never left Devil's Prong. When Timothy learned of Hartwell's disappearance, news that spread quickly through the sparse Ozark community, something inside him finally snapped. He could no longer pretend that he did not know what was happening in that isolated inn. He could no longer live with the terrible weight of a secret that could cost the lives of other innocent people. So it was that, on a rainy morning in May, Timothy Walsh found himself sitting in the uncomfortable chair of Sheriff Hayes's office, telling a story that sounded impossible, but perfectly explained all the mysterious disappearances that had plagued the Ozarks for the past few months. Hayes listened to each word in silence, taking occasional notes and watching the young man's expressions closely. Timothy did not seem to be lying or fantasizing. His details were too specific, his emotions too genuine, and more importantly, his description of Reverend Coleman's watch matched exactly the information Hayes had gathered during his previous investigations. For the first time since the disappearances began, Sheriff Benjamin Hayes had a witness. Finally, the nebulous suspicions that had surrounded the Bender brothers inn were taking solid shape. But witnesses were not enough to arrest 2 respected men from the community. Hayes needed physical evidence, and he knew that getting it would be the most dangerous part of the whole investigation. Sheriff Hayes knew he had only one chance to catch the Bender brothers red-handed. If he alerted any suspicions, if he made a hasty search without sufficient evidence, the 2 men would simply disappear into the dense mountains of the Ozarks like so many others before them. And this time, it would be the criminals themselves who would fade without a trace, taking with them all the secrets buried in that isolated property. The strategy Hayes developed was dangerous, but necessary. He would recruit a volunteer to pose as a prosperous merchant, someone who would seem like an attractive target for the Bender brothers. This human bait would lodge at the inn and try to uncover concrete evidence of the crimes Timothy Walsh had described. The man chosen for this risky mission was David Thornton, a former soldier who had served under Hayes during the Civil War. Thornton was brave, intelligent, and knew the Ozarks like few men. Most importantly, he knew how to behave under pressure and had experience in reconnaissance missions in enemy territory. The plan was simple on the surface, but fraught with hidden dangers. Thornton would pose as a whiskey merchant, traveling between Kentucky and Arkansas, carrying a considerable amount of cash. In fact, counterfeit bills provided by Hayes himself. He would arrive at the inn on a new moon night, when darkness would offer additional protection for any observations he needed to make. Hayes and 2 deputies would position themselves in a rock formation about half a mile from the inn, armed and ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble. Thornton would carry a small whistle hidden in his vest pocket, which he could use to alert reinforcements if the situation became too dangerous. On the night chosen for the operation, a humid Tuesday in June 1882, David Thornton rode down the serpentine tracks leading to Devil's Prong. The clouds completely covered the moon, plunging the Ozarks into almost impenetrable darkness. Only the sound of his horse's hooves against the loose stones broke the oppressive silence of the mountains. The Bender Brothers Inn appeared as a yellowish stain against the night, with lamplight leaking through the windows and a thin column of smoke rising from the chimney. Thornton tied his horse to the wooden post near the entrance and banged on the door with a clenched fist, perfectly mimicking the behavior of a weary traveler relieved to find shelter. John Bender opened the door with his characteristic smile that never reached the eyes. He greeted Thornton warmly, helped him carry his luggage, and immediately offered him a hot meal and a comfortable room. William appeared shortly thereafter, demonstrating the calculated hospitality that had won over so many unsuspecting guests during the previous months. Over dinner, Thornton played his role perfectly. He talked about the thriving whiskey business, casually mentioned the amounts of money he was carrying, and even showed some counterfeit bills while paying for lodging. The Bender brothers listened to each word with increasing interest, exchanging meaningful glances that Thornton pretended not to notice. The first disturbing discovery happened during the meal. As William served more roast meat, Thornton noticed that the table where they were dining had dark stains on the wood that looked like they had been rubbed repeatedly but never completely removed. They were coin-sized blobs scattered in irregular patterns that suggested liquids had splashed onto the surface several times over time. When John got up to fetch more wine from the kitchen, Thornton took the opportunity to discreetly observe the surroundings. Hanging on the walls were a number of farm tools, axes, large knives, saws that seemed to be in exceptionally good condition for implements used in farm work. The blades glowed as if they were cleaned and sharpened regularly, not for cutting wood or preparing food, but for purposes that Thornton preferred not to imagine. But the most shocking discovery came when William led him to the upstairs bedroom where he would spend the night. As he climbed the creaking stairs, Thornton passed through a half-open door that led to another room. For a split second, the light from the lantern that William was carrying illuminated the interior of that space. What Thornton saw made him stop instantly. Stacked against one of the walls were dozens of suitcases, trunks, and travel luggage of all sizes and styles. Some were of fine leather, obviously expensive. Others were simple canvas bags used by rural workers. There was even a small children's trunk decorated with hand-painted flowers, just like the one the Morrison family carried when it disappeared into the Ozarks months earlier. William noticed that Thornton had stopped and quickly closed the door to the room, casually explaining that they kept objects lost by previous guests. He said that they always waited for the owners to come back for them, but that unfortunately, this rarely happened. His voice remained calm, but Thornton noticed a new tension in his movements, as if the man was mentally calculating how dangerous this guest could become. In the room where he would stay, Thornton pretended to get ready for bed, while actually remaining completely alert. He left his boots on, kept the knife hidden within reach, and positioned himself so as to keep watch on both the door and the only window. Outside, he could hear the nocturnal sounds of the Ozarks, owls chirping, branches crackling in the wind, and occasionally muffled voices coming from the ground floor. It was shortly after midnight that the sounds changed. Casual conversations between the brothers were replaced by urgent whispers. Thornton heard heavy footsteps up and down the stairs several times. Then, the unmistakable noise of heavy objects being dragged across the wooden floor. The time had come to discover what macabre secrets the Bender brothers hid in the dark depths of their seemingly hospitable inn. David Thornton remained motionless in his bed, controlling his every breath to look like a man fast asleep. The sounds coming from the lower floor had ceased about 20 minutes ago, but he knew that this sudden stillness was more threatening than any noise. In the Ozarks, absolute silence usually meant that predators were moving. It was then that he heard the first rung of the stairs creak softly. Someone was climbing towards his room, stepping with the deliberate care of someone who did not want to be heard. Thornton closed his eyes and forced his breathing to remain slow and regular, while his right hand moved imperceptibly toward the knife hidden under the pillow. Every fiber of his body was taut, like the string of a bow, ready to react at the right moment. The second step creaked, then the third. Through the gaps between the floorboards, Thornton could see a faint light approaching. It was the yellowish glow of a lantern carried by someone who knew every inch of that house and knew exactly how to move without making unnecessary noise. The light stopped outside his door for several endless seconds. Then the doorknob slowly turned. The door opened just a few inches, wide enough that someone could peer inside the room without fully entering. Thornton kept his eyes closed and continued breathing with the slow rhythm of a man in deep sleep. But all his other senses were amplified to the maximum. He could smell sweat and something metallic, perhaps blood, coming from the person watching him. He could hear a controlled, almost whispered breath. After an eternity, the door closed again. The footsteps descended the stairs with the same silent caution. Thornton waited another 15 minutes before daring to move. When he finally got out of bed, he did so with the precision of an experienced hunter. Every movement was calculated not to produce any sound that could betray his wakefulness. He walked barefoot to the window and looked through the thin curtains. Downstairs in the courtyard behind the house, he could see two figures moving by the light of a lantern. They were John and William Bender, carrying something heavy toward the barn they had built for the winter. What they were carrying was wrapped in canvas, but it had the unmistakable size and shape of a human body. Thornton felt his blood run cold. There was no longer any doubt about what was happening in that isolated inn. The Bender brothers were not simply thieves who robbed unsuspecting travelers. They were methodical killers who turned their apparent hospitality into a death trap for anyone unfortunate enough to carry something valuable through the lonely trails of the Ozarks. But where had that body come from? Thornton was the inn's only guest that night, until the terrible realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. The brothers had another prisoner, someone who had been captured before his arrival and kept alive until that night. Someone who had been killed while he pretended to sleep in the upper floor room, completely unaware of the tragedy that was happening a few meters below. Thornton knew he needed to act quickly. If the brothers found out that he had witnessed the transportation of the body, his own life would be worth nothing. But at the same time, he needed to gather enough evidence to ensure that John and William Bender could never harm anyone again. He decided to go down to the ground floor. The house was plunged into almost complete darkness, lit only by the last embers that still glowed in the fireplace in the main room. Thornton moved like a shadow between the furniture, carefully avoiding the floorboards he had noticed creaking during the day. His goal was to get to the kitchen, where Timothy Walsh had seen the brothers cataloging the belongings of their victims. What he found there exceeded his worst expectations. On the large wooden table, the same one where he had dined a few hours before, was scattered a macabre collection of personal objects: pocket watches, leather wallets, wedding rings, ivory combs, glasses with gold frames. Each item represented a life that had been brutally interrupted in that seemingly hospitable home. But what shocked Thornton most was finding in the center of the table a bound leather notebook where someone had meticulously recorded each murder. The pages were covered with names, dates, descriptions of the stolen belongings, and approximate values obtained with each crime. It was a catalog of death, kept with the coolness of a merchant who writes down his daily transactions. Thornton quickly flipped through a few pages, looking for names he recognized. There was Thomas Mackenzie, the tool dealer who had disappeared in October. The Morrison family was listed with shocking details about each member, including the young children, Reverend Marcus Coleman, the Taylor brothers, Edward Hartwell. All the missing of the past few months were recorded in that hellish notebook, along with dozens of other names that Thornton had never heard of. People who had vanished without a trace, whose fates remained mysteries to desperate families, but who had actually met their terrible ends at the hands of the Bender brothers. At the end of the notebook, on a page still blank, someone had written in neat handwriting, "David Thornton, whiskey merchant, due on Wednesday." Thornton swallowed. His name was already on the brothers' death list. They had planned to kill him the next night, probably in his sleep, like so many other victims before him. If it weren't for Sheriff Hayes's operation, he would have become just another entry in the macabre catalog, documenting years of murders in the Ozarks. It was at that moment that he heard the back door open. The Bender brothers were returning from the barn. Thornton had only a few seconds to put the notebook back in the exact place where he had found it and run silently back to his upstairs room. He climbed the stairs 3 steps at a time, slid into the room, and threw himself on the bed just moments before he heard muffled voices on the ground floor. But now he had the evidence Sheriff Hayes needed: the death notebook, the collection of stolen objects, the transport of the body to the barn. It was more than enough to arrest the Bender brothers and ensure that they faced justice for their horrific crimes. The problem was how to transmit this information to Hayes without alerting the killers that they had been discovered. Thornton knew he was walking a deadly tightrope, where a single mistake could turn him into the next victim of the bloodthirsty duo who controlled Devil's Prong with blood-stained iron fists. David Thornton spent the rest of the night in absolute vigil, listening to every sound that echoed through the eerie Bender brothers' home. From the ground floor came occasional noises, water running, objects being moved, whispered conversations that he couldn't fully decipher. He knew the killers were cleaning up evidence, preparing for another day of pretend hospitality as they secretly planned their next crime. When the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the tattered curtains, Thornton made a risky decision. He needed to get out of that house before the brothers decided to accelerate their plans and kill him during the day. But he also couldn't just run away without completing his mission. Sheriff Hayes was relying on the evidence he could gather. The solution came in an unexpected form. Around 7 in the morning, John Bender knocked on his room door with the usual morning cordiality, offering hot coffee and fresh eggs for breakfast. Thornton took the opportunity to casually mention that he had changed plans during the night. He said that he had remembered an urgent appointment in Little Rock and that he would need to leave right after breakfast instead of staying another night as he had originally planned. John's reaction was subtle but revealing. For a split second, something dangerous flashed in his eyes before being quickly masked by the hospitable smile. He said he understood perfectly. Business sometimes required sudden changes of plans, but he insisted that Thornton at least eat a substantial breakfast before continuing his journey along the dangerous trails of the Ozarks. During the meal, Thornton noticed that William Bender was watching him with a new and disturbing intensity. The younger man asked casual questions about the route he intended to take, about when he hoped to reach the next village, about whether anyone was waiting for him in Little Rock. These were questions that seemed innocent on the surface, but which actually served to calculate when his absence would be noticed, and how long the brothers would have to disappear if something went wrong. It was then that Thornton realized that he had made a fatal mistake. The coffee John had poured had a slightly bitter taste, different from the drink he had had the night before. It was an almost imperceptible taste, masked by sugar and milk, but one that immediately set off all the alarm bells in Thornton's experienced mind. He had drunk adulterated liquids before during the war, and he could recognize the signs of substances that could render a man unconscious or worse. Pretending that he had not noticed anything, Thornton continued to talk normally, while secretly forcing his throat not to swallow another drop of the poisoned coffee. When the brothers were not looking, he poured the rest of the cup into a plant near the window, but he knew it was too late. He had ingested enough for the effects to begin to manifest soon. He needed to get out of that house immediately. He got up from the table with deliberately slow movements, claiming that he wanted to check his horse's harness before leaving. The Bender brothers offered to help, but Thornton insisted that he could do it all himself. After all, an experienced tradesman always personally took care of his equipment. It was a plausible excuse that would buy him a few precious minutes outside the house. Once in the yard, Thornton made his way quickly to the stable, where his horse was tied. His hands were already beginning to shake slightly, a sign that the substance in the coffee was taking effect. He had perhaps 10 or 15 minutes before he was too incapacitated to ride. It was while preparing his horse that he made the most shocking discovery of the entire operation. Behind the stable, in an area that was not visible from the main house, was a row of shallow graves marked only with stacked stones. They were not proper graves, but rather hasty graves dug in the red earth of the Ozarks. Thornton quickly counted. There were at least 20 of these mounds of earth, perhaps more hidden among the trees. Each grave represented a life lost. Each pile of stones marked the ultimate fate of someone who had trusted the apparent hospitality of the Bender brothers and paid for that trust with his very existence. But there was no time to investigate further. Thornton could feel his legs growing weak and his vision starting to blur around the edges. Whatever substance he had ingested, it was acting quickly. He mounted his horse with increasing difficulty and headed toward the trail that led away from Devil's Prong. He had to reach Sheriff Hayes before the effects of the poison left him completely defenseless. As he left the inn's courtyard, Thornton looked back one last time. John and William Bender were standing on the porch, watching his departure, with expressions that no longer tried to hide the malice behind the mask of hospitality. They knew he had discovered their secrets. They knew he was running away. And from the cold smiles on their faces, they also knew that he wouldn't get very far in the conditions he was in. The race against time had begun. Thornton had perhaps an hour before he was completely unconscious. The rendezvous point with Hayes was at least 45 minutes away on horseback under normal conditions, and these were definitely not normal conditions. As he forced his horse to gallop along the rocky trails of the Ozarks, Thornton could hear other horses beginning to follow him in the distance. The Bender brothers did not intend to let him escape alive. They had decided to hunt him down in the mountains like a wounded animal, and they knew that terrain much better than he did. The deadly chase through the misty mountains of Missouri was about to begin with the lives of David Thornton and potentially many other people, depending on who would get to Sheriff Benjamin Hayes first. David Thornton's desperate ride through the Ozarks became a race against two equally deadly enemies: the poison that ran through his veins and the Bender brothers who galloped after him with the cold determination of seasoned assassins. The world around him began to oscillate dangerously, as if the mountains were swaying from side to side in a macabre dance. Thornton knew those symptoms. During the Civil War, he had seen soldiers poisoned by contaminated water, showing exactly the same signs. blurred vision, impaired motor coordination, increasing nausea, and a terrible feeling that the body was betraying the mind. He calculated that he had a maximum of 30 minutes before he passed out completely. The sound of the chasing hooves was getting closer. He forced his horse off the main trail and entered a narrow passage between rock formations he vaguely knew from previous reconnaissances. It was a more difficult path, full of loose stones and low branches that would scratch any careless rider, but offered the advantage of being less predictable. The Bender brothers knew the main roads like the back of their hand, but they may not have mastered every secondary shortcut of the Ozarks. The strategy partially worked. The sound of the chase subsided somewhat, suggesting that the killers had wasted time trying to figure out which direction he had taken. But Thornton knew it was only a temporary victory. Men who had killed dozens of people and hidden the bodies for years would not easily give up on eliminating a witness who could destroy everything they had built. It was when the dizziness almost made him fall off his horse that Thornton realized something that would change everything. Smoke. A thin column of white smoke rising between the trees, perhaps 200 yards from his position. It wasn't the kind of smoke coming from a house. It was the agreed signal he'd set up with Sheriff Hayes in case he needed urgent help during the mission. Hayes was there. Somewhere among those trees, the sheriff and his deputies were waiting. Thornton mustered his last reserves of strength and steered his horse toward the smoke. Each movement was a fight against the poison that tried to steal control of his muscles. Twice he almost slipped from the saddle when low branches hit him, but the promise of close help kept him focused through the fog that was beginning to envelop his consciousness. He arrived at the clearing where Hayes had set up camp at the very moment his legs finally gave way. He slid off the horse like a sack of grain and slammed into the ground, hard enough to arouse echoes among the surrounding trees. But he was able to speak. He was able to convey the essential information before his tongue became too heavy to form words. Notebook, kitchen, 20 graves behind the stable. Sheriff Hayes was a man who understood urgencies. He wasted no time asking detailed questions. As soon as he heard Thornton's broken words, he signaled to his 2 deputies and mounted his horse. He left one of the men to watch over Thornton and set off immediately toward Devil's Prong with the other deputy, knowing that every minute of delay would allow the Bender brothers to destroy more evidence, or worse still, to flee altogether. The sheriff's ride back to the inn was a race against time of another kind. Hayes knew he was dealing with desperate killers who would not hesitate to use violence against law enforcement officials, but he also knew that this was probably his only chance to capture the men responsible for so many disappearances and deaths in the Ozarks. When they came within sight of the inn, the scene they found confirmed all their darkest suspicions. The Bender brothers were in the courtyard, frantically carrying objects from inside the house to a wagon already prepared for travel. Even from a distance, Hayes could see that these were luggage and personal belongings, probably the remains of their victims that they planned to take with them on the run. A makeshift fire burned near the stable, where papers and documents were quickly destroyed. They were preparing to disappear forever. Hayes and his deputies split up, approaching the property from different directions to prevent escapees from escaping through the trails. The sheriff took his Winchester into a firing position and shouted across the morning distance of the Ozarks, "John and William Bender, stop where you are! You are under arrest for murder!" The answer came in the form of a rifle shot that passed dangerously close to Hayes' head. William Bender had positioned himself behind the wagon and was using the stacked luggage as makeshift protection. John ran toward the house, probably looking for more ammunition or trying to destroy final evidence. The ensuing firefight echoed through the mountains like thunder from a violent thunderstorm. Hayes and his deputy had the advantage of elevated position and better military training. But the Bender brothers knew every inch of that terrain and struggled with the desperation of men who knew that capture would mean certain hanging. For 15 terrifying minutes, Bullets ricocheted off the rocks of the Ozarks as the four men moved between trees and rock formations in a deadly dance. It was when John Bender tried to run toward the stable, probably to catch horses and try to gallop away, that the deputy got a clear shot that knocked him to the red floor of the yard. William, seeing his brother fallen and bleeding, made the desperate choice to surrender. He dropped his rifle and raised his hand, shouting that he was giving himself up. Hayes approached cautiously, keeping the gun drawn, while his deputy checked on John Bender's condition. John was still alive, but badly injured. Blood flowed from a wound in his chest, dyeing red the land where so many other victims had shed their blood. In his eyes, Hayes saw no regret, but only the cold rage of a predator that had finally been captured. The hunt was over. The Bender brothers, responsible for one of the most brutal murder series in the history of the Ozarks, were finally in the hands of justice. But the shocking revelations that would emerge during the investigation of the estate would show that the true extent of his crimes was even worse than anyone had imagined. The investigation that followed the capture of the Bender brothers would reveal horrors that shocked even the most hardened men on the frontier. Sheriff Hayes, accompanied by a county coroner and 3 additional deputies, spent the next 5 days digging up the secrets buried on the Devil's Prong property. What they found would turn that place into one of the most macabre crime scenes in Missouri history. The first place investigated was the barn that the brothers had built during the winter. On the outside, it looked like an ordinary agricultural structure, but inside it revealed its true sinister function. The floor was covered in a thick layer of quicklime, a substance that accelerates the decomposition of organic matter and helps mask odor. On the wooden walls, iron hooks were strategically positioned as in a butcher's shop, but they were not intended for animal carcasses. In the darkest corner of the barn, covered with loose planks, Hayes discovered a rectangular pit approximately 6 feet long by 3 wide. The earth at the bottom was stained with a dark color that left no doubt about its purpose. It was here that the Bender brothers prepared the bodies of their victims before burying them in the shallow tombs scattered around the property. But it was in the main house that the most disturbing discoveries awaited the researchers. The leather notebook that Thornton had seen in the kitchen was just the beginning. Hidden in secret compartments built into the walls, Hayes found detailed records that documented 3 full years of murders. The brothers had not begun their murderous career in 1880, as everyone thought. They had been killing travelers since the fall of 1879. The records were kept with the cool precision of a commercial ledger. Each entry included the victim's name when known, the date of the murder, a description of the stolen valuables, and the approximate value obtained from the subsequent sale of those items. There were also notes on methods used, places where bodies were buried, and notes on which types of travelers offered the greatest profits with the least risk. What shocked Hayes most was discovering that the Bender brothers did not act alone. Buried at the end of one of the notebooks were references to partners in Springfield and contacts in Joplin who helped sell the stolen items. The assassins had built a criminal network that stretched across several Missouri cities with accomplices who turned the spoils of murder into hard cash without asking inconvenient questions. Even more disturbing was the discovery that some seemingly respectable merchants from nearby towns knew exactly where the goods they bought from the brothers came from. Letters found in an iron box buried behind the house revealed correspondence in which these trading partners requested specific types of objects: gold watches, jewelry, good quality weapons, as if they were placing orders in an ordinary shop. The excavation of the tombs began on the morning of the 3rd day. Hayes had brought additional workers from Carthage, men with stomachs strong enough to handle what they could find buried in the red earth of the Ozarks. What they found exceeded their most gloomy estimates. There were not 20 graves, as Thornton had quickly calculated, There were 37 graves scattered over an area of approximately 2 acres behind the property. Some contained the remains of adults. Others revealed the small, fragile bones of children. The entire Morrison family was found in a common grave, along with the simple toys the children were carrying when they disappeared. Thomas Mackenzie, the first missing person who had alerted the authorities, was identified by the remains of his work tools, buried along with the body. The Reverend Marcus Coleman was recognized by the golden clock that Timothy Walsh had seen on the kitchen table, now hidden in a leather pouch next to the preacher's bones. But the most disturbing discoveries came from the oldest tombs. In burials dating from the brothers' first year of operation, Hayes found evidence that not all of the victims had died quickly. Some skeletons showed signs of injuries that would have caused prolonged suffering before the final death. Rusty chains found in several graves suggested that some people had been held prisoner for extended periods before they were murdered. The investigation also revealed that the Bender brothers developed increasingly sophisticated methods over time. In the first murders, they apparently attacked the victims in their sleep or in ambushes on the nearby trails. But as they gained experience and confidence, they began to use poisons and substances that knocked their victims unconscious, allowing for more controlled and silent killings. The poison that nearly killed David Thornton was identified by the coroner as a mixture of plants native to the Ozarks, probably taught to the brothers by some local connoisseur of medicinal herbs. It was a formula that caused gradual unconsciousness, followed by respiratory paralysis, a death that would seem natural to anyone who found the body days later. During the investigation of the house, Hayes also discovered an impressive arsenal hidden in secret compartments. Rifles, pistols, knives of various sizes, axes modified for use as weapons, and even some implements that seemed to have been specifically designed for torture. The Bender brothers were not simply opportunistic killers. They were organized predators who had turned murder into an efficient and profitable commercial operation. As investigators continued to dig for the secrets buried in Devil's Prong, news of the crimes spread through the isolated communities of the Ozarks like wildfire in a dry forest. Families who had lost loved ones during the past few years finally had answers to questions that had plagued them for so long. But along with these answers came the terrifying realization of how many deaths could have been avoided if someone had investigated the disappearances sooner and deeper. The interrogation of the Bender brothers began on a freezing July morning in a makeshift room at the Carthage police station. John Bender had survived his chest wound, but remained chained to an iron chair as he slowly recovered. William, physically intact, but psychologically shaken by the capture, alternated between periods of absolute silence and outbursts of anger that revealed the true bestial nature hidden behind the mask of hospitality. Sheriff Hayes had called in an experienced Kansas City prosecutor, a man named Augustus Wittman, who had a reputation for getting confessions from the most hardened criminals. Wittman arrived in the Ozarks, carrying a leather briefcase filled with evidence collected from Devil's Prong and an iron determination to uncover every sordid detail of the crimes that had terrorized the region for years. It was William Bender who broke first. During the third day of interrogation, when confronted with the detailed notebook of his victims and the personal effects found buried next to the bodies, William finally began to speak. But his confessions revealed a troubled mind that saw the murders not as horrific crimes, but as necessary business transactions in a region where the law came slowly and the weak deserved their fate. "These people were coming to us," William said, with a coolness that sent shivers down the spines of Prosecutor Wittmann. "No one forced them to stop at Devil's Prong. They chose to trust strangers in a land where trusting is costly. We only charge the price of this naivety." The revelations that followed painted an even darker picture than investigators had imagined. The Bender brothers did not choose their victims at random. They had developed an elaborate system to identify travelers carrying significant valuables, often obtaining information through a network of informants scattered throughout the taverns and inns of nearby towns. Merchants who bragged about recent profits, families who mentioned savings saved to buy land, preachers who collected donations to build churches, all became marked targets before they even reached the secluded inn. The brothers were given detailed information about when these people would leave, what routes they would take, and approximately how much money they carried. Old Mackenzie, William continued, referring to the first known victim, had the misfortune to boast in a Springfield tavern about how much money he would make selling tools in Joplin. 3 different men sent us letters telling us about him. It was impossible to pass up such an opportunity. John Bender, still recovering from his wound, but mentally alert, occasionally corrected details of his brother's confessions. His participation revealed an even more calculating and organized mind. It was John who developed the meticulous recording system found in notebooks. It was he who established contacts with receivers of stolen goods in the larger cities, and it was his idea to turn the sporadic murders into a regular lucrative commercial operation. William was always too impulsive, John said during one of the interrogations, speaking of his brother, as if discussing the flaws of a troubled business partner. He wanted to kill anyone who showed up with more than a few dollars in their pocket. I had to teach discipline, planning, how to choose targets that would make real profit without attracting unnecessary attention from the authorities. The confessions also revealed horrific details about the methods used. The Morrison family, including the young children, had been poisoned over dinner with the same substance that nearly killed David Thornton. But the poison was not always fatal immediately. Some victims were paralyzed, but conscious for hours, forced to watch the preparations for their own burials as they battled the growing paralysis. The Reverend Marcus Coleman had suffered a particularly cruel fate. The brothers discovered that he was carrying not only money from the collections, but also information about other religious communities he planned to visit. They kept the preacher alive for 3 days, torturing him to get details about other potential victims before finally killing him when they realized he would rather die than deliver more people into the hands of the killers. Men in the church always carry more money than they appear, William explained with disturbing matter-of-factness, and they know other people with money. Coleman gave us names of at least 6 families worth investigating. Some even showed up here months later, just as he said they would. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was the discovery that the Bender brothers weren't the only ones operating this kind of scheme in the Ozarks. During interrogations, they casually mentioned other special inns scattered around the region, establishments that served similar purposes under the facade of hospitality for travelers. "Do you think we were the only ones smart enough to see the opportunities these trails offered?" asked John with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There are at least 4 other places between here and Arkansas where wealthy travelers disappear with suspicious frequency. The difference is that we were more organized, more careful in choosing our victims." That revelation forced Sheriff Hayes to reconsider dozens of other disappearances that had been filed as accidents or bandit attacks on the roads. If the Bender brothers were telling the truth, the Ozarks harbored an entire network of assassins who turned hospitality into a death trap for unsuspecting travelers. The confessions continued for more than a week, revealing details about specific victims, methods of murder, and the fate of the stolen objects. Each interrogation session added more names to the growing list of the dead, more families who would finally have answers about loved ones who had disappeared without explanation. Throughout this process, neither John nor William Bender showed any sign of repentance or remorse. To them, the murders were simply business. The victims were products that generated profit. The suffering caused to the families was irrelevant compared to the financial benefits obtained. "We offered a service," William said during one of the last interrogation sessions. We cleared the roads of people who were too foolish to survive on the frontier. The strong live, the weak die. It's the natural law of the mountains. It was this utter coldness, this complete lack of humanity that was perhaps more disturbing than the murders themselves. The Bender brothers had become something more than common criminals. They were evolutionary predators who saw other human beings as resources to be exploited, not as people with a right to life and dignity. By the time the interrogations were finally over, Prosecutor Whitman had enough evidence to secure convictions for 37 confirmed murders, as well as suspicions of involvement in at least a dozen other disappearances. It was one of the most comprehensive and horrifically detailed criminal cases in Missouri history, and the Bender brothers' revelations forever changed the way authorities would investigate disappearances in the border regions of the United States. The trial of the Bender brothers began in the fall of 1882 in a Carthage transformed by the national attention the case had attracted. Journalists from St. Louis, Kansas City, and even Chicago arrived in the Ozarks to cover what many called the Missouri trial of the century. The small town, accustomed to the silence of the mountains, teemed with a dark energy fueled by morbid curiosity about the details of the murders. The makeshift courtroom could barely accommodate all the people who wanted to watch the proceedings. Family members of the victims traveled from several states to see the killers of their loved ones face justice. Timothy Walsh, the young man who had been the first witness to break his silence, gave testimony with a courage that impressed even the most skeptical observers. David Thornton, completely recovered from the poisoning, recounted in detail his infiltration of the inn and the macabre evidence he had uncovered. His description of the death notebook and the hidden tombs made several people in the audience cry openly, while others left the room unable to bear the images his words evoked. Prosecutor Whitman built a case that was both meticulous and devastating. Each physical evidence was presented with surgical precision. Each confession was corroborated by archaeological discoveries in the tombs of Devil's Prong. The defense attorneys, experienced men brought in from Kansas City, fought valiantly to find extenuating circumstances or question the validity of the evidence, but faced a mountain of evidence that made any defense virtually impossible. John Bender maintained his characteristic coolness throughout the trial. Sitting in the defendant's chair, he observed the proceedings with the expression of someone watching a card game with no personal interest in the result. Occasionally, he would take notes in a small notebook, as if he were analyzing the efficiency of the justice system for future use. William, on the other hand, began to show signs of mental deterioration as the trial progressed. The detailed descriptions of his crimes, repeated day after day, before a horrified audience, seemed to finally penetrate the armor of indifference that had protected his psyche during interrogations. He began to have episodes where he shouted about voices in the mountains and vengeful spirits that whispered in the winds of the Ozarks. The verdict was announced on a gray November afternoon, guilty of first-degree murder on 37 separate counts. The sentence, handed down by the judge in a solemn voice that echoed through the silent room, was death by hanging for both brothers. But the execution would never happen. The night before the date was set for the hanging, John and William Bender were found dead in their cells. John had managed to obtain some kind of poison, possibly the same one he used on his victims, and poisoned both himself and his brother during the last meal they shared. They left a handwritten letter that said simply, "The Ozarks call us back. We will not allow strangers to decide our fate." The brothers' deaths deprived many families of the satisfaction of seeing the killers face public justice, but it also closed a terrible chapter in Missouri's history. Further investigation revealed that they had hidden poison in a hollow cavity of one of John's teeth, a last trick of men who had spent years planning every detail of their criminal activities. The property at Devil's Prong was abandoned immediately after the trial. No family wanted to live in a place where so many atrocities had been committed, the nature of the Ozarks gradually reclaimed the Sinister Inn. Wild vines covered the wooden walls. The roof collapsed under the weight of successive winters, and eventually, only stone foundations marked the spot where the Bender brothers had operated their company of death. But the impact of their crimes echoed far beyond the physical destruction of property. The revelations about the network of special lodges mentioned during interrogations led to investigations throughout the Ozarks region. 3 other establishments were discovered operating similar schemes, resulting in additional arrests and the discovery of more than 60 graves scattered throughout the mountains of Missouri and Arkansas. The case of the Bender brothers had exposed an epidemic of organized killings that the authorities did not even suspect existed. Sheriff Benjamin Hayes became a nationally respected figure for his meticulous and persistent investigation. He implemented new protocols for investigating disappearances in border regions, protocols that would be adopted by police departments across the American West. His insistence on the importance of witnesses like Timothy Walsh set legal precedents that would protect informants in future cases. David Thornton never returned to the itinerant trade. The experience at Devil's Prong had changed him profoundly, and he dedicated the rest of his life to helping families who had lost loved ones to unsolved crimes. He established an organization that offered rewards for information about disappearances, financed in part by the sale of objects recovered from the Benders' property that could not be returned to specific families. Timothy Walsh used the reward offered for his testimony to study law, eventually becoming a district attorney. His specialty was investigating crimes against migrant travelers and workers. Vulnerable populations who often disappeared without their deaths being adequately investigated. The families of the victims finally had answers. But along with those answers came the terrifying realization of how much suffering their loved ones had endured in the final moments. Some found peace in the knowledge that the killers had faced justice. Others carried the grief for the rest of their lives, haunted by the images conjured up during the trial. Devil's Prong still exists today, but the name was changed to Cedar Junction in an attempt to erase the dark memories associated with the original location. Occasionally, historians and curious people visit the overgrown ruins, where the Bender Brothers Inn operated its macabre business. Some people report strange sensations among the broken foundations, a coldness that has no relation to the weather, whispers that seem to come from the wind but carry indistinct words. The case of the Bender brothers remains one of the most brutal and systematized crimes in American history. It demonstrated how human predators can hide behind facades of normality and hospitality, turning basic trust between strangers into a deadly weapon. More importantly, it showed that even in the most isolated and seemingly lawless regions, the persistence of determined investigators can eventually bring justice to those who believe to be beyond reach. In the silent nights of the Ozarks, when the wind blows through the centuries-old trees and the moon hides behind the clouds, it is still possible to feel the weight of the history that unfolded in these mountains. The crimes of the Bender brothers remind us that true evil rarely announces its presence with obvious signs. Sometimes it invites us to dinner, offers a warm bed for the night, and smiles with warm hospitality as it plots our destruction. If you've made it this far on this journey through one of the darkest chapters in American history, leave a comment telling us what you think of this true story that haunted the Ozarks for so long. Subscribe to the channel for more investigations into mysteries and crimes that have marked our history. And the next time you need to rely on the hospitality of strangers on a secluded road, remember the terrible lessons the Bender brothers taught us about the dangers that can lurk behind the warmest smiles.